What's going on YouTube? It's your boy Lonnie Reacts, and today we are back with another video. This video is titled The Brutality of the Samurai by the Shogunate. Now, if you know or if you don't know, Japan has a really elite PR team. Like most of the shit about Japanese history just go swept under the rug. I mean, they were really brutal and they were really violent. So let's hop into this video and see if I can learn anything I didn't know. 1571. What was this? The Sengoku Jira?
On the 12th day of the 9th month, Nobunaga invested Mount Hiei. Surging round in swarms, his troops in a flash set fire to a multitude of holy Buddhas, sacred shrines, monks' quarters, and sutra scrolls. How miserable it was to see it all reduced to ashes and scorched earth. At the foot of the mountain, men and women, young and old, ran about panic-stricken. In a feverish haste, barefooted, they all fled up Mount Hachijoji, seeking refuge in the shrines there. Soldiers, shouting battle cries, advanced up the mountain from all sides. One by one, they cut off the heads of priests and laymen, children, wise men, and holy men alike. They presented the heads to Lord Nobunaga, saying, "Here is an exalted prelate, a princely abbot, a learned doctor, all men of renown at the top of Mount Hiei." Moreover, they captured countless beautiful women and boys and led them before Nobunaga. "We don't care about the evil monks," they shrieked, "but spare us." Nobunaga, however, absolutely...
I think I remember learning about this. Nobunaga, this nigga was going on a killing spree, bro. And one of his generals, he was even like, what the fuck? And that's one of the reasons Nobunaga ended up getting betrayed. Is one of the reasons he was never able to completely unify Japan. It's crazy though, cause like just being a rude person, being a disgusting person is what knocked him out of commission. Like it's insane.
Refused to reprieve them. One by one, they had their heads chopped off, a scene so horrible to behold. Thousands of corpses lay scattered about like so many little sticks. A pitiful end.
Really, bro. Like,
This
really.
game, you're not ready for.
There is a myth out there, an awful misconception, that all samurai were duty-bound warriors of great morals and virtue, courageous figures who all live by a code akin to the idea of chivalry, who stood to defend the weak and tear down injustice, who had unparalleled discipline and used their great mastery of the arts and martial prowess for good and honorable purposes. This is all wrong. The samurai were brutal.
Very brutal.
Beneath the veil that
I remember learning about how in like the Sengoku era or even before the samurai, they had the ability to simply cut down any peasant they wanted to in order to, practice. They could just make the excuse, oh, I'm practicing, what I'm saying, sharpening my blade, something like that. But they could do that shit. They could do whatever they wanted, basically. Not whatever they wanted, but to a certain extent down there. It's really insane.
that is the flowery imagery and popular ideas of pre-modern Japan lies the oppressive ruling warrior elite who dominated the country for centuries. I've touched on elements of this quite a bit in the past, through other history videos that delved into the myth of the fake idea that was Bushido, and even how the samurai viewed things like loyalty. Most recently, I've also delved into the cruelty of samurai culture as it is displayed in some of the fantastic films directed by Masaki Kobayashi in both Harakiri and Samurai Rebellion. But this real underlying nature of the actual brutality of the samurai was always a subject I've been meaning to return to. The sad truth is that the earlier example I gave of a first-hand account of the massacre that occurred on Mount Hiei in 1571 was by no means an isolated incident, despite the fact that it is so well known. Rather, what I wanted to highlight about it was more of the common occurrence of savagery and bloodlust that would have been likely frequent throughout the war-torn history of pre-modern Japan. Throughout this video, we are going to be exploring a bit more of the casual and normalized brutality that existed among the samurai of Japan. And I'll be honest, it's very likely that this video may get age restricted by YouTube. In fact, the original script for this video was initially much longer and had plenty of more grisly and gruesome details. However, at a certain point, I do feel it starts to get a bit gratuitous. So I've actually gone back through and dialed things back just a bit. Don't worry, I am not going to be trying to hide or gloss over anything. But I do think it is more important to remember that the real point of this video is not to overindulge into the blood and guts of it, but instead to focus more on the underlying ugly reality that it symbolized. To identify and remember that the culture of the samurai was at times one that was very brutal, cruel, and unjust in ways that many pop culture portrayals of samurai often try to just skip over.
I remember, my bad for constantly pausing, but I remember one time learning about I think it was a shinobi. He was trying to assassinate somebody. I think he was trying to assassinate the emperor. So they boiled this nigga and his son alive, bro. Like, I think he had to hold his son up in the air while he was getting boiled. And then, eventually he gave out and he ended up dropping his son. Insane.
On a wider note, it needs to be said that this video is being done in collaboration with many other history-focused YouTube channels, such as Brandon F., The Welsh Viking, Chris the Redcoat, and so many more, as we look to cover a wide range of misconceptions throughout various parts of history. You can find a link below to the wider playlist in which all the videos in the collaboration can be found. There is a ton of great info to go through to help you expand your knowledge and come to find out more about so many misunderstood aspects of history. But with that said, let's dive back in and unravel a bit more behind the ugly nature of samurai brutality.
Odin Valhalla Rising, now available on mobile and PC, exclusively with Google Play Games.
The notion of day-to-day cruelty that the samurai engaged in goes directly counter to the widely romanticized pop culture image of the Japanese warrior class being one centered around stoicism and upholding honorable virtues. But just like how Bushido is in reality a modern concept that the samurai never really adhered to, the idea that the samurai were above acts of savagery is also a modern myth. The samurai were products of their time, belonging to an ugly and violent age. The same can be said for probably almost every other warrior culture that existed throughout history.
Precisely.
For example, we all like to think of the heroic image of the chivalrous knight, when in reality, they too were guilty of acts of brutality that were common to the time. But this video is just about the samurai, and how their culture, which has been so idealized over the years, was unfortunately also one that was filled with examples of warriors engaging in truly horrific acts of slaughter, pillaging, rape, and torture. Of course, one very big disclaimer that needs to be mentioned is that obviously not every samurai across time was guilty of these actions. Yet still, we have enough examples to go off that really do paint a gruesome image for some of the ugly norms of pre-modern Japan. For some of you, this might already be pretty common knowledge, but for others, you may end up looking at samurai much differently by the time this video is done. What I want to do first is start out by discussing some of the uglier aspects of samurai warfare, particularly when it comes to battlefield behaviors and the aftermath. One of the most common samurai misconceptions out there is that of the honorable fighter. This goes back centuries and includes examples like samurai calling each other out by name on the battlefield before engaging in a heated duel. Sadly, very little of this appears to be true. There would be very little opportunity within the context of a battle to have a formal one-on-one. Not saying it never happened, but it would be very difficult to do so, or to a larger extent make it very difficult to try to show any other form of honorable intent while trying to survive. There are ideas of forms of appropriate battlefield etiquette that appeared at times, but in reality, most samurai probably just wanted two things out of battle, with obviously the first thing being victory. But the second thing being still very important, recognition. And this is where the extremely significant concept of head-taking comes into play.
I remember this.
The idea of taking and displaying defeated enemy heads is not something that is at all unique to pre-modern Japan. Yet the way in which the samurai ritualized the practice definitely is. I actually made a whole video about this topic a long time ago if you want to learn more specifically about it. The truth of the matter, though, is that on the battlefield, samurai were ruthless head takers. Cutting off the heads of defeated enemies was the way in which warriors, eventually both samurai and ashigaru, could display proof of their service to their lord during an official after-battle head viewing ceremony. And the more significant the individual's
Yeah,
head,
it was also a way to like, yeah, I'm the one who killed him, so what I'm saying, maybe I can get some coins, some gold, more fame, recognition. Just really, man. I think that was normal for a lot of cultures around the world, though, doing things like that, showing the head as proof of, your victory or what you accomplished.
or the greater amount that are presented, the greater the reward. This meant that samurai would not only earn status and recognition for their deadly accomplishments, but also rewards which could include that of wealth, prized items or weaponry, titles, and even land.
Yep.
Yet head-taking could at times be a time-consuming process, and on the battlefield, haste was everything. It was in situations like these that instead of taking an entire head, bodies could be carved up for other easier-to-carry trophies like noses or ears. This wasn't ideal because one couldn't really say who it belonged to, but it was a way in which a samurai could prove how many enemies they had slain. However, what gets more fascinating is that there are a lot of actions connected to this that might today get thought of as more dishonorable. For example, in a lot of cases, cutting off the head of an enemy was probably not something always done on an individual basis after the enemy had already been defeated. Rather, in many instances, one might just be unfortunate enough to be grabbed by multiple individuals and held down while another hacked off the head. In fact, I'd argue that this might be the way it occurred the most, being that a warrior would likely try to claim a head as quickly as possible, lest they lose it among the scores of other corpses littering the battlefield, or get stolen by another warrior. Groups of warriors might have even tried to work together to claim as many heads as they could in an efficient manner. This then opens the door to also discussing other shady head-taking practices, like taking a lower-ranking soldier's head, but then trying to present it as someone who was more significant. And obviously this could have very serious consequences for those who were discovered to
That
be
probably
deceitful.
happened a lot too.
But of course, the ruthless brutality of the samurai did not stop after a battle had ended. In fact, one could argue their cruelty might have only gotten worse once victory was achieved. We have plenty of examples of samurai engaging in horrific acts of slaughter, rape, and pillaging. All things that once again should not be solely attributed to the samurai, as they are merely ugly elements and realities present in all warfare. One terrifying example I want to highlight is that from the Imjin War,
The
samurai
MJ War.
invasion of Korea,
Yep.
where their brutality was on shocking display
Oh
within
my
a
God,
foreign
that
country.
was insane.
In the
Learning about the
aftermath of
MJ
the
War.
siege of Busan, with the Japanese victorious and Korean resistance falling apart, a samurai by the name of Yoshino Jingo Zaimon wrote of the massacre that was to come. Those who could not conceal themselves went off towards the east gate, where they clasped their hands together, and there came to our ears the Chinese expression "mano, mano," which was probably them asking for mercy. Taking no notice of what they heard, our troops rushed forward and cut them down, slaughtering them as a blood sacrifice to the god of war. Both men, women, and even dogs and cats were beheaded.
What the fuck?
What is further interesting to note was that the Japanese likely assumed the Koreans spoke Chinese, something which illustrates how little they actually knew about the people they were fighting. Some estimates put the amount of Koreans who were slain at Busan as high as 85,000, and similar acts of butchery would continue to occur throughout the duration of the war. As you can see from this example and the earlier example of Mount Hiei, the samurai were by no means above killing not only defeated enemies but also innocent and unarmed civilians as well. Men, women, children, and even animals.
Alright, face it. Your life is a complete mess right now.
I'm not gonna lie.
Laundry's not
I gotta
folded,
get
you
like
haven't
YouTube
exercised in
TV,
weeks, you're spending way
something to block these ads.
And while, of course, what is mostly remembered is the killing, we should also not forget about the incidents of rape and looting that was not uncommon as well. with perhaps the most famous example being that of the aftermath of the siege of Osaka in 1615, when after victory was assured, Tokugawa soldiers swept through the surrounding town, killing, looting, and raping. In particular, it should be noted that looting was also something that many commoners were said to have done as well, scavenging supplies off of a fresh battlefield and finishing off warriors who were slowly in the process of dying.
That makes
As
sense.
one famous story goes, Akechi Mitsuhide is said to have even been killed by looters who chased him down as he fled from his defeat at Yamazaki.
Damn.
What all these examples do is help to paint the picture or wider idea that life itself was a fickle thing in pre-modern Japan. And while there is so much that can be said about those that were killed in battle or in the aftermath, there is also something that can be said about others who instead chose to give their lives, and the often gruesome ways in which they did. Now, I'm sure most of you are already well aware of the myth out there that samurai would always kill themselves rather than be defeated, or kill themselves upon any other form of dishonor. And although there are plenty of times where this did occur, making seppuku, ritualized suicide, a common enough thing in pre-modern Japan, it is important to know that this was not always the go-to way a samurai would act in the face of defeat. In almost every instance, when facing defeat, a samurai would try to flee to fight another day rather than being killed. There was nothing dishonorable in retreating. That is a myth. Samurai fled or withdrew from battles all the time. The only real shame came with defeat, but even with defeat, living to fight another day was definitely worth retreating for. However, there were also instances where they didn't, or perhaps had no chance or choice to. This opens the door to plenty of grisly tales of how samurai either chose to die or go out fighting. In many cases, the norm appears to simply be finding a secluded spot to commit seppuku, which I'm sure many of you are already well aware of just how awful that was. The practice commonly consisting of using a blade to cut open one's belly to spill out one's guts,
That would have been
with
so
hopefully the
painful.
swiftest way to bring an end to the pain by having a second, or kaishakunin, close by to lop off the head once the belly was thoroughly cut. This is by far seen as the norm across most of Japanese history, but there are of course other gruesome stories we have for other brutal ways samurai chose to die. One of the most famous and earliest tales is that of the Taira samurai who chose to die at the Great Battle of Dan no Ura in 1185. It was here in the closing conflict of the legendary Genpei War, when faced with total defeat, the samurai of the Taira chose to drown themselves in the water beneath their boats
I learned
rather
about
than be
this.
captured or be killed by the Minamoto. So instead, scores of them were said to have leapt into the water, either allowing their heavy armor and weapons to carry them under, or instead by tying heavy objects like anchors to them to pull them down into the depths of the sea. Another gruesome and famous example is one which involves more of self-sacrifice in order to save one's lord. This is that of Murakami Yoshiteru, who attempted to deceive a besieging force by pretending to be his lord while cutting open his own stomach and throwing his own organs at the attackers below, while his lord escaped. Acts of self-sacrifice were a common enough occurrence in pre-modern Japanese warfare, and it is important to know that the reason behind doing
I'm not gonna lie, that's the definition of loyalty. Like that man was very loyal to his I don't think they were called daimyo during that time, so his lord. That man was really loyal to his lord, bro. Hey, I gotta give it to him. Hey.
so wasn't always just to protect one's lord. Sometimes it would occur simply to make a point, or in a sheer act of desperate defiance. But sometimes, these actions also spread beyond just a single samurai. If a samurai in defeat also knew that his family was in danger, he would often assure that they too would be slain to save them from the torment of
Oh
execution,
my God.
torture, and
I never
rape.
even thought about this.
Family members might even choose to take their own lives before death was forced upon them. But it should be noted that if a family member was significant enough on their own, they might still be spared. This is where I want to bring in the interesting story of Oda Nobunaga's sister Uichi, who although would be not allowed to take her own life alongside her first husband Azai Nagamasa after his defeat in 1573, would finally do so with her second husband, Shibata Katsuie, after his defeat 10 years later in 1583. We can see how the first time around, despite the fact that it is believed she was more than willing to die alongside Nagamasa, The fact that she was Nobunaga's sister allowed her and her children to be spared. However, once Nobunaga had been killed in 1582, she was finally able to go out on her own terms after the defeat of her second husband Katsuie at Shizugatake. Yet, Oichi's story is a bit more unique, and in many other instances of this situation, things turned out much more grim. But moving past times of war and violence, the brutality of the samurai did not cease, as their oppressive and often unjust rule was consistently seen. While entire clans were snuffed out of existence during the many wars within pre-modern Japan, plenty more families would be eradicated during peacetime as well, for little other motive than political reasons. And while there are so many examples of the cruel authoritarian nature of the Tokugawa shogunate throughout the Edo period, the examples I want to share instead come from that of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Tokugawa Ieyasu's predecessor. One of the most famous and unfortunate examples of political injustice comes in 1595, with that of the sad story of Toyotomi Hidetsugu. Hidetsugu was the nephew of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who later actually adopted him as his son. After the death of Hideyoshi's firstborn legitimate son, Tsurumatsu, in 1591, it can be argued that Hideyoshi sort of panicked because he no longer had any heirs and was getting quite old. This is when he turned to Hidetsugu, who he wished to succeed him and carry on the family name and ruling the country. For about 2 years, all was going well with Hidetsugu, who was increasingly becoming a central figure within the Toyotomi regime, preparing to take things over from Hideyoshi. Until, suddenly, Hideyoshi would surprisingly have a new son with one of his concubines, this child being the famous Hideyori. After this, it can be seen that Hideyoshi continued to try to push Hidetsugu out of the picture more and more to make room for his new legitimate heir. Things all came to a head when rumors began to circulate that Hidetsugu was guilty of treason, resulting in his banishment and later an order to commit seppuku in 1595, completely cutting him out of the picture entirely.
Damn.
However, just his death was not enough. Hideyoshi sought to purge everything from that entire line of the family, ordering the execution of Hidetsugu's wife, concubines, children, and all other vassals and figures connected to him.
What the fuck?
In a single action, Hideyoshi eradicated an entire line of his own family, just because he wanted to ensure that his new son would be unopposed to succeed him. And Hideyoshi's cruelty did not stop there. Japan has an interesting history when it comes to Christianity, something which gained real traction in Japan for a time, but then, starting with Toyotomi Hideyoshi and continuing on into the Edo period, was more and more suppressed due to the tension it had caused throughout the country.
Around the same time.
This is where we can
16th
see the
century.
famous incident of the 26 martyrs of Japan. Occurring in 1597, this was an incident in which Hideyoshi ordered the execution of 26 Christians who had previously been forbade from preaching. These included 20 Japanese Catholics, 4 Spaniards, 1 Mexican, and 1 Portuguese. Hideyoshi would order their noses and ears cut off before being crucified and later impaled with spears. And something else that is interesting to note here is that the act of crucifixion was actually quite a common method of execution in pre-modern Japan, which makes it somewhat ironic that it ended up being used here with actual Christians. Now, these are
He did
just
that on
2
purpose.
examples of the cruelty that Toyotomi Hideyoshi was responsible for, and there are plenty more examples that we can attribute just to him. But what both of these do is illustrate that even during times of relative peace, there were both tremendous amounts of injustice and brutality within the samurai-dominated society of pre-modern Japan. And this is where I think would be a good point to leave things. Obviously, this is all just a minor scratch on the surface of this subject. There are tons of more examples we could get into in terms of brutality in all forms. We could go on and on, making this video hours long. I've touched on so many more gruesome details throughout plenty of my past videos as well, but what I really want to hammer in here is the simple idea that although samurai often get held up as honorable and virtuous warriors, in reality they were also truly brutal. But just because samurai culture was often much more cruel than many like to think about, does not wipe away the aspects that we also tend to enjoy about it too. I worry that talking more about the uglier elements of the samurai will have the negative effect of turning people off of Japanese history. But once again, a comparison
History
to
is
make
just
is that we don't just stop
history is
admiring
history,
the
bro.
image of medieval European knights because they too engaged in acts of brutality that were normal for the time.
Probably
We should
worse.
not do the same
You
for
know?
samurai either, especially when, like I just said, and have been saying throughout this entire video, the casual brutality exhibited by the samurai was the norm for the age in which they lived. Included within the overall idea of the samurai is plenty of things, from acts of heroism to traditions and mindsets, to their wider story throughout the centuries, and of course the brutality they displayed. Just because their culture was often very oppressive doesn't mean that we also can't admire the more virtuous aspects and examples we have of them. If that was the case, it would be hard to look back on almost any military history of the past, because ugly realities lie everywhere. So no, we shouldn't stop liking samurai history because the samurai were brutal. Rather, what is important is that we just don't forget the truth either. If you enjoyed learning about this subject of the wider misconception that is the real
Not gonna lie, this was a really good video. I learned a few things that I didn't know. For example, the common misconception of, anytime a samurai was defeated, they'll just immediately kill themselves. It didn't always happen. A lot of samurais would rather live to see another day and retreat, which is perfectly fine. I mean, you don't gotta look tough all the time. But also, a lot of samurais would just die fighting. So I mean, I also learned some more stuff. That story about Hideyoshi and his I think it was his predecessor. How he had a son, and he basically just pushed that nigga to the side, like, nah, bro, you good. Then rumors started coming out, like, what I'm saying. I doubt it was even rumors, bro. The nigga probably just felt like something was gonna happen, so he had to get him out the way. But man, that was a really good video. And if you enjoyed it, please like this video. I'll see y'all next time.